My name is Stacey Patton. My story begins in foster care. I'm an 80s, 90s kid from New Jersey. Spent the first 5 years of my life in a foster home in East Orange, New Jersey. Didn't know I was a foster kid. Didn't know the difference between an adoptive mom, a foster mom, and a biological mom. And by the time I turned 5 years old, I was being told that I was going to get new parents. So I began going on a series of visits to meet my new adoptive parents. They were a middle-class African-American couple who lived in the suburbs. They were very religious people. So I went on those visits, and while I was on those visits, my adoptive mother started hitting me. Before the age of 5, I had never experienced an adult putting their hands on me. The abuse began even before I was permanently placed in their house and before my adoption was legalized. I thought it was normal. My adoptive mother would use her hands. Then she graduated to using objects like belts, extension cords, switches, wire hangers, shoes, broomsticks, whatever she could get her hands on. There was a lot of brainwashing that came along with it. She would tell me that she was hitting me because she loved me, because she wanted to protect me, because I needed to learn right from wrong. Because we are African American, she saw this as a way to protect me from racism, from the police. So I'm 6, 7, 8 years old receiving these messages very early on. And in my adoptive family and community, pretty much all the kids I knew were hit by their parents. And so this was pretty normalized in the culture, in the neighborhood, at our church. This is how you raise kids. Nobody ever asked me, the judges, the therapists, the social workers, what's going on? Do you like this family? Does anybody hit you? I wanted to protect her. I didn't want to go back to foster care. I didn't want her to be arrested. The first time she hit me, I was 5 years old. I had just come home from school, kindergarten. I don't remember exactly what happened, what caused her to get angry, but what I remember was her slapping me in my face. And I was absolutely shocked. And I had never been hit by an adult ever in my life. It was betrayal. And I immediately started crying. Her reaction was to hug me, to say, "Oh, mommy's so sorry. I'm so sorry." So here I was crying, and then she was hugging me. I thought, okay, this was an accident. She didn't really mean it. It's never going to happen again. But it did, almost on a daily basis. I remember her picking me up and throwing me across the room and just landing and hoping that I would not hit my head, injure myself really bad. The worst incident was when I was about 7 or 8 years old. I always went to private schools where the teachers had been given permission to hit us, and the principal had permission to do this if we acted out. It was a private Christian school. Another child in the school had hit me, and I hit the child back. And all my classmates knew how mean my adoptive mother was. And so this child said to her, "I'm going to tell your mom." And when she came to pick me up, that's what happened. And on the car ride home, she basically said, "You're going to get it." She used to make me take my clothes off during beatings. She would say, "I'm not whipping any clothes." She used an extension cord, one that went into the back of a coffee pot and into the wall. That was her weapon of choice. And so she started beating me with this. And I remember laying between the dresser and her bedroom, and she had one foot on me, and she was just in a rage. And I remember trying to block this cord with this arm. At some point, I stopped feeling. I couldn't feel anything. I felt like something was hitting me, but I couldn't feel the pain anymore. I could hear it. Then I started smelling something burning, and it was my skin. And I thought, okay, I'm ready to die. I hope this doesn't stop, because if it stops, that's when I'm going to feel the pain. So I just laid there, didn't fight back, and she just kept wailing on me. And finally, when it was over, I stood up. I could see her breathing. Her hair was a mess. My hair was a mess. And she looked at me and she said, "Oh my God." I turned to the mirror to this side of my face. All of the skin, you can kind of still see some of the marks, was off my face. And I stood there just shocked. Like, I don't know how you're going to explain this one. I don't know what story we're supposed to tell people about this one. I was just frozen and disoriented. My face felt like it was on fire. And she tried to fix it by putting peroxide on it. this open wound, just in burns, and giving me a bowl of ice cream and some pound cake. That is the one instance that will always stay with me. She would say, I don't enjoy whipping you. It hurts me as much as it hurts you to do this. And so I had to listen to all of this verbal justification afterwards about how horrible I was, how I'm to blame for making her lose control in this way. I rejected her as my mother. I never loved her. I could not wait until the day that I ran away from home and would never look back. And by the time I was 12 years old, that moment happened, and I left and never went back. So because I went to Lutheran school and Catholic school, they were white-run schools. All of my teachers were white, principals were white, the nuns were white, and they used corporal punishment in those schools. Sometimes they'd call the parents if a child did something especially egregious to come, deal with the kid. And I remember instances where children were beaten by their parents in front of us, in front of the class. School was another zone of intimidation and violence. So I didn't feel like I could go to my teachers and say, hey, this is happening at home. I just felt like they would just say, oh, well, you deserved it because we beat y'all here in the classroom. The school was not a safe space to disclose any of that stuff that was, happening. Couldn't cry. Shut up or I'll give you something to cry about. So I was taught early on to disassociate from my feelings, from my body, so that I could stay alive, to gaslight myself. So I ran away twice. The first time I was about 9 or 10 years old. I wrote a note saying, your daughter has been kidnapped. Don't try to find her. I left. And I got pretty far, actually. I was on a highway, a major highway. I had no sense of danger. So I ended up running into a police officer who questioned why I was on a highway. And I told him I had been kidnapped. And he was like, what did he look like? What was the license plate? I was like, I don't even know what a license plate is. So they took me to the police station and they gave me this whole lecture about not lying to the police. Now, mind you, child abusers, they brainwash you and they tell you that you can't trust anybody. And so my adoptive mother, her big thing was you can't trust white people. You can't trust the police. You can't trust social workers because all they want to do is break up Black families. And so I finally did tell the police. I said, I ran away from home because my adoptive mother is always beating me. And so then that's when they got social services involved. And I remember being in a room with all of these strangers, men and women, being asked over and over again to talk about the things that she did. They took pictures. They made me strip down to my underwear and undershirt. Pull my shirt up, pull it down, pull it up again, pull it down, hold your arms out, hold up your legs, turn around, let's take pictures here. So it was exhausting to have to do that. I was terrified because now I knew I was in trouble because I told on her and she was going to be angry and she was probably going to beat me again. And so I was taken out of that house for a while, for some months, while there was an investigation. Eventually I was put back in the house. And she was told that she could not put her hands on me again and that if she did this again, she would be arrested. So I ended up back in their house again. We went to therapy for some months. She didn't put her hands on me for a while. And then we stopped therapy. My case was closed and the beating started all up again. I didn't know who to call to say, hey, she's still hitting me. We're not going to therapy. Why haven't y'all checked in on me? I'm stuck here again. So I was about 8, 9 years old. So I spent a few more years and started getting bigger, started watching movies like Farrah Fawcett and The Burning Bed. I learned about the Menendez brothers who, told folks that they had been abused and they killed their parents. I watched Celie in The Color Purple pull a knife on Mr. at the Thanksgiving table. Oprah Winfrey was talking about domestic violence. People still weren't really talking about child abuse in the same way. But I'm looking and listening and watching these stories and thinking, this is my story. If it's bad for adults to be treated like this, why isn't it also bad for a child to be treated in this way? There were stories about escape and, taking control over your life. And I thought, I can't rely on any of the adults in my life, police, social workers,
teachers, other family members, and everybody knew what was going on, neighbors, to save me. So I'm going to have to save myself. And so she hit me again in my face. Eye was swollen, lip was busted, and I left. Middle of the night, went to the police station, and I said, I can't, keep going through this. So I ended up in a place called the Anchor House, which was a shelter in Trenton, New Jersey for abused and runaway kids. And, the intake person there was so afraid that I wasn't going to be believed. My adoptive mother convinced me that nobody believes children over adults. After all, these were middle class, God-fearing, Christian, hardworking people who lived in a nice house in the suburbs. They weren't, the image of child abusers. All the stereotypes that people have when they think about, people who are monsters and mistreat kids. That's not what my adoptive parents look like at all. And so I went through, a series of juvenile shelters, runaway homes, bounced around through the state of New Jersey. Finally, I met a therapist. And I told that therapist, I said, if you put me back in that house, somebody's going to end up dead, and it's not going to be me. And so that's when folks took me seriously, and they said, we should not put this child back in this home. I ended up in more long-term group home type situations until I was 14 years old and won a full scholarship to the Lawrenceville School. I went from foster care to prep school and finished out my childhood in boarding school in a safe place where all I had to do was learn and heal and play sports and get some therapy and try to figure out who I was going to be. Start searching for my real family and ensure that I'm never in a situation where anybody ever puts their hands on me. It was tough because I lacked emotional literacy, because my whole childhood I had been in survival mode. I didn't know how to talk to my classmates who had vastly different lives. So it was very lonely and it was isolating for me. I was sad. I was also going to school in the boarding school in the 1990s at the height of the multicultural wars. And so my classroom experiences were full of a lot of microaggressions as well. In my public school, which was predominantly white at the time, it had middle class and working class white kids, which are a different breed from very wealthy white kids with different values and just a different way of thinking and moving through the world. So that was interesting to me and different to me. And I moved through my boarding school experience with the secret that I was there without parents, that these scars on my face, on my body, I had been through, just terrible trauma. And I didn't want them to know that because they already had stereotypes about my blackness, about my black girlhood. And I didn't want to layer that with being an adoptee. I was still in the foster care system and a child abuse survivor. And so I did have a therapist at Lawrenceville, who was absolutely wonderful. And those 3 years that I was there, we met on a weekly basis to deal with a lot of the stuff that I was dealing with. And then at the end of my sophomore year, I was reunited with my biological relatives because I had searched for them through the adoption registry. And then that added a whole nother layer of complexity to the story. So when I was a little girl, I always had these fantasies about how I would be reunited with my biological family. It would happen on Oprah. I'd be on her show and she would ask me about what it was like being an adoptee, and I'd tell her that story. And then the audience would be there listening, and she would look at me and say, I've got a surprise for you. Because she's Oprah Winfrey, she could make magic. And my family members would be behind the stage, running out to hug me, to cry, to say how much they missed me, that they had always been waiting for me, that there's a room waiting for me in their house. That was my fantasy. That same therapist helped me work with the registry, search for my biological relatives. And the phone call came that they had been located. And so there I was sitting in his office, and he said, Stacey, I've got good news and I've got bad news. Which do you want first? I said, it doesn't really matter. He told me that my great-grandmother had been located. my two aunts, that I had an older brother, older sister, and a younger brother. They had all kind of, that family stayed together. So I was the only one who had been given up for adoption. And the bad news was that my biological mother was dead, that she had committed suicide when she was 25. And so I just lost it. In that moment, I felt like all that surviving I did, enduring the abuse, physical, emotional, verbal, trying to be a good student, a good athlete, all the things that I was trying to do good, so that when I reunited with my birth mother, she would keep me this time. She wouldn't give me away, that I'd be this perfect kid who got good grades, who never got into trouble, would always be quiet, would always be good, would try to be perfect. It was over. My big dream had just fallen apart in that moment. And I was sad and I was angry. It was terribly unfair. But maybe 10 minutes into crying and using my sleeves to wipe my eyes and nose, I thought, okay, I got to pull it together. Stop feeling. Turn off those feelings. You can't afford to grieve, right? Go back into your default mechanism. Survive. Don't feel this moment, because if you do, you will fall apart. And you've got these siblings that you need to meet. You've got these aunties. You've got a great grandmother. Pull yourself together. Shut off those feelings. And so I did. And so the reunion happened there at my boarding school. And it was the most awkward thing ever. I mean, you see these in popular media, these reunions, and people are always emotional and hugging and all that kind of stuff. Nobody ever prepares an adoptee for that moment. I didn't know what to say to these people. I didn't know whether I should call my great-grandmother Nana, my aunt's aunt. So should I immediately, turn that on? Because the reality is that adoption legally defines you and your birth relatives as strangers forever. And we had nothing in common except genes. It was very odd. There's a backstory that your biological relatives are told about why you went missing. I didn't know what that narrative was. Adoption is always the result of some kind of loss or tragedy, and it is mired in secrets and lies. So I didn't know how to manage all of that at like 15 years old. I was still an outsider. It's strange looking at people who are a biological mirror and there's no genuine emotional attachment or connection. They had their own histories of loss and trauma, dealing with our biological mother's suicide. My biological father still wasn't in the picture. I hadn't found him until I was in my late 20s, maybe, when I was reunited with him. It was tough because I felt like, if my biological relatives don't accept me, if I don't fit in here, where do I fit in the world? Who am I? What am I supposed to be? We were strangers to each other. And that was really difficult for me to accept because no one had prepared me for the other side of adoption, the reunification. And so I was deeply depressed. My early 20s, late teens, early 20s, I was severely depressed. I didn't want to be here. And, my biological mother killed herself when she was 25. So I thought, I'm not going to live to be 25. I didn't know what love was. I didn't know what unconditional love was, belonging, attachment, any of that kind of stuff. And, so I felt like I really didn't have much to live for. And at that point, I really needed some severe therapy again. I literally had to step away from everybody for a number of years. I had to leave home physically, metaphorically, spiritually. I had to reject everything and move them out of the way so that I could see myself on my own terms. And I couldn't see that when I was younger because I was still in survival mode. I had self-worth issues. I didn't think I was worthy of love. I didn't know how to accept hugs. I didn't know what to do with kind words. I didn't feel like I deserved it because I had scars, because I was an abused kid, because I was abandoned, I was rejected. I had this victim narrative. There are moments where I'll remember something, a memory comes up. Rather than letting it overtake me, I'll stop and I'll allow myself to see it again, to hear it again, to move through it again, maybe even cry about it, maybe get angry about it. But then, I'll breathe through it, practice some mindfulness. I'll say next, we're not going to go there. change the channel. Okay, let's think about something good, something different. Let's reframe this. I'm not back there in that moment. So I'm able to pull myself out of it rather than allowing myself to get sucked back into it and then start revisiting all the other moments that then make me feel terrible. There are times when I feel very sad and I allow myself to quit. I'll quit a day. I'll be like, you know what? I'm not feeling good about some things. I'm thinking about old stuff. Let me, go get some jerk chicken and some Haagen-Dazs chocolate chip ice cream, and I'm gonna sit on this couch and watch Netflix, and I'm just gonna do nothing with my life today and go to sleep to move through those feelings and then to get past them. Flash forward a couple of decades. I'm 46, happy person, healthy person. I'm a college professor, journalist, author, child advocate. I've written a few books. Writing was really a big part of my healing journey as well. So I wrote a memoir about my childhood called That Mean Old Yesterday. It was published by Simon & Schuster when I was in my PhD program at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And then some years later, I wrote another book called Spare the Kids, which focuses on the evolution of corporal punishment within African American families and communities. This book was inspired by the Adrian Peterson controversy and the Baltimore mom controversy as well. Both involved parents using physical punishment against their children, and those cases sparked nationwide conversations about hitting children. So I wrote a book on the heels of that, and I travel around the country doing keynote addresses around this issue, trainings with social workers, law enforcement, clergy, foster parents, clinicians, you name it. And then recently became a children's book author. My first children's book was published this past April. It's called Not My Cat. It's a COVID era story about a young woman, myself, who doesn't want a cat, but this stray cat keeps coming to my house, and I feed it, play with it, and have this sort of reluctant relationship with it. And everybody's like, what's your cat's name? I'm like, it's not my cat. And so it became a kind of a social media sensation that went viral. And for a year long, until I sold my house. And I did not bring the cat with me. The woman who purchased my house ended up taking care of the cat. So their story continues, but it's a cute, funny little story about love, about friendship, companionship, being kind to animals. It's about loving without possessing. It's about joy on purpose. So I'm really liking the whole children's book writing, because so much of my other work deals with tough subjects, and it's hard writing about child abuse in its myriad forms. And so being a children's book author allows me to directly impact children in a different way, that I can bring them joy through pictures and simple words and give them a sensory experience, to help them laugh and feel safe and immersed in a different world, even if they're sad, and to trigger their imagination to something good and colorful and vibrant. So I'm really happy about that. I'll show you the copy. That's it. To survivors, you've got to do the work of healing. It's hard. It's lifelong. You can't go around it. You've got to go through it. But I promise you, if you do it, you'll come out of the experience different. You have to acknowledge the ways in which trauma changed you. Pain changes the brain, changes the nervous system. It has altered the very essence of who you were when you came into this world. You may not have language for it, you may not have the actual memories of what happened, but they indelibly shaped who you are and how you show up in the world. But you never deserved any of it. But part of doing this work, you got to ask, how did my experiences before I started developing memory recall and language and all of that kind of stuff, how did those experiences change me? And when I started remembering and collecting memories and all of that, How did all of that change me? So you can develop the language to understand what it did to you. And once you have that language, that framework, and that understanding, then you can develop that empathy that you're going to need to say, this was not my fault. I was shaped by an environment, shaped by broken people. And I had to go through that journey. I still have to do the work because someday I'll be a 50-year-old, 60-year-old. And I don't know how age and my brain is going to change and my nervous system is going to change and how I'm going to reconceptualize and understand losses and adoption and scars and all of that kind of stuff. I don't know. So this healing is not a destination. It's ongoing and it takes work.